project. The subject is far too big and my own expertise far too limited. It's really, I'm a Europeanist by training, to give you a comprehensive account of the Cold War. Rather, my impressionistic presentation will focus on 3 points: the state of play of Cold War history, the point when the conflict came to a sudden end in 1989, 1991, real briefly, then a brief review of the archival developments as they unfolded since the collapse of the socialist regimes in Russia and Eastern Europe. Third, some of the new findings that have emerged. And finally, fourth, some conclusions about how those findings have shaped our understanding of and approaches to the history of the Cold War. Let me add that many of the materials I will be talking about are freely accessible on the Cold War Project's website. That's the website address there, CWIHP, Cold War International History Project.org. Go to our virtual archive and you can freely search through a good number of the materials that I'll be talking about. There also are some flyers out for you to take home with additional information about the Cold War Project. I'm particularly delighted to see so many students here tonight. Hopefully one of the ideas that will come out of my lecture is that Cold War international history is still very much work in progress. It's still being researched and written as we speak, and in particular with regard to Southeast Asia, there is a huge amount of work still to be done, plenty research to be done, plenty of dissertations to be written, and I hope some of you will join that effort. We badly need you for this enterprise. As the founding father of the Cold War Project, Geddes, of course, was not a newcomer to the field. With his Bancroft Prize-winning dissertation turned first book on the United States and the Origins of the Cold War, published in 1972, Geddes had launched an effort to synthesize and move beyond earlier debates about the history of the Cold War. Those debates had, as some of you may know, dominated by the traditionalist school, a group of historians that, starting in the late 1940s and 1950s, had depicted U.S. foreign policy after World War II as the pursuit of global peace and prosperity, which were to be achieved through multilateral political and economic institutions set up at the end of World War II. In the face of Soviet subversion of democracy in Eastern Europe, the story runs, and attempts to expand its influence elsewhere, the United States was forced to adopt a policy of containment to oppose the growing dangers of communist aggression. This Manichaean account of the origins of the Cold War stemmed in part from the fact that many of its protagonists, many of the authors, had themselves been officials, had themselves been part of the US government during and immediately after World War II, so had a certain stake in legitimizing American policy. And it was doubtlessly fueled by the lack of primary evidence. Central to the argument of this group of authors was the assumption that the Soviet Union, under its leader Joseph Stalin, had been bent on global expansion. This orthodox consensus increasingly came into question against the backdrop of the Vietnam War in the 1960s, as historians led by William Appleman Williams, others, questioned the depiction of the American role as a purely defensive, connoted by the containment paradigm, as purely defensive, and pointed to the underlying economic motivations in casting the United States as a primary, proactive, at times outright aggressive actor in the events that crystallized the Cold War. At the heart of the Cold War was, in this revisionist school's view, the American drive to reconstruct an open, liberal capitalist global order dominated by the United States. While the revisionist school of thought was as reductionist in its analysis of Soviet and, in fact, American policy as the traditionalists. Its great contribution was that it opened up for the first time a real debate. Once the Cold War consensus of the 1950s had broken up and spurred by the declassification of US government documents, the 1970s and 80s witnessed a proliferation of new approaches to the history of the conflict, from corporatism, which transposed the corporatist compromise of key functional groups of the US economy to the international arena, to Thomas McCormick's world systems theory, which looked at the impact of the international system on US and Soviet policy, to Gaddis's post-revisionism, which emphasized power, security, and geopolitics, and tried in many ways to combine a number of the earlier approaches and perspectives. Thanks to the increasing availability of US documentation, the American government no longer appeared simply as a black box in many of these accounts, and much more focus was given to domestic sources, bureaucratic politics, and core values, for example, in Melvin Leffler's A Preponderance of Power, published in 1991. Disparate as they may seem, all of these approaches to the history of the Cold War had in fact a lot in common. They were written while the conflict was still going on. They were written largely by Americans and a few Europeans, based almost exclusively on American archives. They were united in their obsession with the question of who was to blame for the rise of the Cold War. And as such, they were an extension and reflection of the American political debate over the country's foreign policy. They also lacked, the fine achievements of Sovietologists and China experts notwithstanding, by and large, the consideration of a sophisticated understanding of, and yes, empathy, not to be confused with sympathy, with the other side of the Cold War confrontation, the Soviet Union and its allies. This was in many ways a one-sided history, derived from the perspective and archives of just one side of the story. Compared to the availability by the late 1980s of thousands, if not millions, of documents in US archives and increasingly Western European, in particular British archives, historians had to rely on scarce and problematic evidence when it came to analyzing communist or Soviet perceptions, behavior, decision-making. They had to rely on published official statements, newspapers, memoirs, the occasional smuggled-out document, or declassified Western intelligence reports, in and of themselves of an uncertain quality. The Velvet Revolutions in Eastern Europe and the implosion of the Soviet Union in 1989, 1991 ushered in a period of unprecedented access to the secret chambers of the communist parties and governments with which the West had found itself engaged in a mortal struggle just a few years past. Though the 1980s glasnost and perestroika under Soviet President Gorbachev had brought first efforts to deal more honestly with the blank spots in Soviet history, the availability of Russian archives changed dramatically in what we have come to call the golden years of access in Moscow, the years 1992, 93, 94. The declassification process in Russia was spurred by the Yeltsin administration's trial against the Soviet Communist Party, in the course of which a large body of archival materials from the Communist Party's archive was released, as well as President Yeltsin's what I call archival diplomacy, in the course of which he would reach deep into the still inaccessible presidential archive to present significant collections of materials to former Cold War allies and adversaries, such as in the case of Hungary and South Korea. In fact, Most of the documentation that we now have, for example, on the Hungarian Revolution in